Jorge Mario Bergoglio. We all know that name, don't we? He was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, and just a year ago, he was unexpectedly elected the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. And upon being elected, he selected, as we know, this unique name for himself, Francis, after the 12th century founder of the Franciscan order. And he thus became the first Francis in the history of the papacy. And his choice of that name was based largely on a singular trait that Francis exhibited and that Bergoglio had hoped to be able to emulate, had already emulated, in fact, as a Roman Catholic priest and as a bishop. And that virtue, that trait, was, of course, humility. The early Francis led a very Spartan existence. He eschewed all honors and even refused to obtain his own personal copy of the Bible. Because at a time in the 12th century when all books were still copied by hand, to possess a book was considered to be a luxury, and St. Francis abhorred all signs of luxury. Now, Pope Francis's behavior has never reached this extreme, but for a religious leader of such tremendous power and authority, serving what is perhaps the wealthiest non-governmental institution on the face of the planet, Francis has proven to be rather exceptional. He rejected the palatial quarters occupied by his predecessors in favor of a modest apartment. And he elected to ride in a compact car, I think it's a Ford Focus, rather than the famous Pope Mobile. And in these respects, he probably surpasses even the Dalai Lama in his embrace of simple and unpretentious living. Now, the perks and the privileges accorded the popes and the priests of the Roman Catholic Church has been a fixture for so long that New York Times columnist Frank Bruni was almost ecstatic in writing about the Vatican's newest occupant last September. He said, "It was a revelation that a man can wear the loftiest of mitres without having his head swell to fit it. That he can hold an office to which the term infallible is often attached without forgetting his own human failings." And Bruni went on to contrast the Pope's deportment with the culture at large, where humility has little, if any, currency. "I felt like a bird watcher who has just stumbled upon a dodo," he said. And having been declared a rock star by Rolling Stone and other popular publications, Francis himself has demurred. "To depict the Pope as a kind of a Superman or celebrity seems to me highly offensive," Francis said. And perhaps this is the primary reason why he has garnered so much attention. Among leaders and celebrities of all stripes, religious, political, academic, in the world of entertainment, he is truly countercultural. One need only recall the stubborn pride, the utter cluelessness of former Congressman Anthony Weiner or Toronto Mayor Rob Ford. Recall the self-satisfied posturing of a John Boehner or a Chris Christie to appreciate the contrast presented by this new Roman Catholic Pope. You know, today, even someone who feels qualified to teach a college-level course on humility doesn't necessarily embody that trait. As a guest lecturer at Yale University last spring, New York Times columnist and pundit David Brooks conducted just such a class on humility, which would be fine, except that Brooks assigned 3 of his own columns as required reading. Now, granted, these columns may have been quite germane to the topic, but we all know that over the centuries, humility has been thoroughly investigated by any number of more preeminent thinkers. For instance, Confucius lived and taught way back in the 6th century BC, and his Analects contain numerous references to this virtue. And stories about Confucius indicate that he himself was exceptionally modest about his abilities. That unlike some other important Chinese scholars, he was not afraid to admit when he was wrong. To make a mistake and to not correct it, he said, is indeed a mistake. And likewise, Socrates encouraged his 5th century BC followers to own up to their ignorance. Legend has it that when the infallible oracle of Delphi accorded Socrates the honor of being the wisest of all men, Socrates concluded that, yes, I deserve this distinction only because I alone will acknowledge the depth of my ignorance about the things that really matter. In a similar vein, the contemporary physicist Stephen Hawking has said, that real genius requires radical humility, for only when one truly and deeply does not know are they open to what is possible. Now, Socrates also refused to acknowledge that he had students or disciples. Rather, he saw himself as the facilitator of philosophic discussions with a group of what he called associates. And in contrast to his rivals, the sophists, Socrates never accepted payment for his services or his advice. A long succession of Christian thinkers has extolled humility as an estimable character trait as well. And typically, the virtue humility was contrasted with pride, which, according to the 6th century Pope Gregory the Great, was the queen of vices. For from this poisonous root, pride, all the other vices spring. So much for praise. Some commentators reject this traditional view of humility, and they argue that it, in fact, should not be regarded as a virtue. Tanya Kotsos is one such detractor. To begin with, she says, consider the etymology of this particular word. It comes from the Latin humilis, which literally means low. The terms humble and humiliate share a common origin. The meaning of both those words is, as we know, less than salutary. When someone is humbled, they are brought low. To humble a person is to show them up, to put them in their place. Humble is also a synonym for poor, insignificant, inferior. It can suggest a person who is given to bowing and scraping before his or her betters. And humility has also been associated with pathology. In his classic study of religious experience, William James describes at some length the so-called saintly personality. Such individuals, he says, harbor these exaggerated feelings of moral deficiency and or grave culpability. And despite their exceptional piety, their generosity of spirit, men and women like this, of saintly temperament, are convinced that they can never measure up to their parents' or society's or God's standards and expectations. Such humility, James suggests, has a decidedly neurotic quality about it. But do self-abasement and these feelings of inferiority typical of the saintly personality, do they reflect the real essence of humility? Well, no more than the egoism of a Donald Trump or the hubris of a Vladimir Putin fully disclose the nature of pride. Just as there is such a thing as proper pride, the kind of pride that gives us confidence, that allows us to feel reasonably good about ourselves and the ability to act upon our ambitions, well, there is also such a thing as proper humility. The problem in both cases lies in excess. All things in moderation, Aristotle advised, and that applies in spades to the exercise of all the human virtues. Now, although humility and pride are often considered to be opposites and even antithetical to each other, I would suggest that they are actually perfectly compatible and quite often highly complementary. Like that evocative Oriental symbol, the yin and the yang, these represent two behavioral tendencies which, if they're cultivated properly, can produce a balanced personality. A couple of examples. We've already heard this morning from Jesus of Nazareth. In his parables and in his conversations, he praises humility, he extols it, and he exhorts others to emulate his own practice of servant leadership. And yet Jesus also exudes confidence, determination. No, he has no use for arrogance or grandiosity. He relentlessly criticizes those who, as he puts it, lord it over others. But on the other hand, he comes to the aid of the downtrodden, those who have been humbled by their betters. He helps them to recognize their inherent dignity and worth. He helps them to regain their self-respect. And this same combination of pride and humility has informed the personalities of other figures like Abraham Lincoln, who understood that as a wartime president, he had to be strong and decisive, which he often was. Lincoln always insisted that the buck stopped with him, but our 16th president was also acutely aware of his imperfections, which caused him to agonize over the grave issues that came across his desk. He was resolute and confident in his authority, and yet he was never imperious, and he was given to homespun, self-deprecating humor. Toward the end of his life, he said, "I claim not to have controlled events, but I confess very plainly that events have controlled me. Albert Schweitzer is also worth considering here. He was a polymath whose published works in philosophy and theology and biblical studies and musicology had already earned him considerable acclaim even before the age of 30. And Schweitzer, as we know, left all of this behind in order to study and then to practice medicine. And he felt called to serve as a medical missionary in the depths of Africa, and he spent better than half of his life treating patients, presiding over a hospital in which he had invested a great deal of his own blood, sweat, and tears. Well, over time, the world began to recognize the extraordinary nature of his humanitarianism. Schweitzer's reputation grew. Major publications declared him to be the greatest man in the world. He received a multitude of honors, including the Nobel Peace Prize. And yet, through all of this, he was able to keep his ego firmly in check. He typically wore old, patched clothes, old shoes, traveled third class on European rail, and he exhibited a very relaxed sense of humor. So, for instance, on one occasion, he was traveling by rail here in the U.S. when, sitting in his seat, train humming along, he is approached by two older women who say, "Excuse me, sir, do we have the pleasure of speaking with Professor Einstein?" "No," Schweitzer said, "unfortunately not. However, he is an old friend of mine. Would you like for me to give you his autograph?" The women were delighted by this gesture, and so Schweitzer wrote, "Albert Einstein," by way of his friend, Albert Schweitzer. Nevertheless, the kindly Dr. Schweitzer ran his hospital with a firm hand. "Some say that my hospital resembles a zoo," he commented, "but in this zoo, I am the chief gorilla." Like Schweitzer, Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic worker movement, lived to serve. And she did so with quiet persistence. And because of her efforts and her example, today there are 100 houses of hospitality scattered across the continent. Day was kind as she possessed a profound sense of responsibility for those whom the economy had left behind. She described capitalism as a filthy, rotten system, but she also expressed gratitude for the opportunity to serve herself as an agent of mercy. Revered for her good works, Day deflected all praise, saying, "The Lord has done it all. We just try to be adequate instruments of His will." People like this, Schweitzer, Day, they fit Joseph Badaracco's profile of quiet leaders who go about their business effectively, but without a whole lot of fanfare. And leaders of this description, Badaracco writes, do not overestimate their abilities. They do not strive for unattainable goals. They are modest about their achievements, and they recognize that most things worth doing are neither grand nor are they likely to be permanent. As one quiet leader put it to Badaracco, "Look, all I'm trying to do is leave a trace on the sands of the beach." But despite their modesty, Badaracco's quiet leaders are persistent, they are determined, they're able to bounce back from disappointments and setbacks. They believe in themselves and they believe strongly in the projects that they have undertaken. And it is this winning combination of modesty and a strong faith in their own efficacy that sets these leaders apart from vainglorious types like George C. Custer or Douglas MacArthur or Dick Cheney. Now let me suggest just a couple of other reasons humility qualifies as a virtue. At the personal level, I have found that it helps me to be a better listener. Lacking humility, a person may well conclude that they are the only one that has anything worthwhile to say. That certainly fits Chris Christie's profile. I suspect that at some time or other, all of us have been party to these one-way conversations in which it was very difficult for us to get a word in edgewise. And sometimes people who over-talk like this are just feeling nervous and insecure. But people who subject us to a monologue may very well believe that their own ideas and experiences are so much richer than anybody else's that they deserve a rapt audience. True humility shines forth in the presence of someone who listens to us carefully, and responds appropriately. When, as Kay Lindahl observes, we learned to listen from the point of our interconnectedness in order to hear what is being said. And that's very different from the kind of listening that is polite, but disinterested, because we're really just waiting for an opportunity to seize the floor again. In his book, Healing the Heart of Democracy, Parker Palmer urges us to be people of both chutzpah and humility. He says we must have the confidence to speak up and to know that we have the right to be heard, that we have something important to say. But we must also realize that our own personal truths are always partial, and that therefore we are obliged to listen to other points of view with openness and respect. And then second and finally, humility is important at the planetary as well as the interpersonal level. It is because of the pride and the hubris of past generations that the environmental problems we now face have, quite honestly, become nearly insurmountable. By treating the natural world as an insensate resource, wholly subject to our will, toward which we have no reciprocal duty, with this attitude, we have dug ourselves into a very deep hole. And Aldo Leopold, for one, understood that a change of attitude, and not just improved technology, would be needed to right this relationship. A conservationist, he famously declared, is one who is humbly aware that with each stroke of the axe, he is writing his signature on the face of the land. And likewise, Wendell Berry has warned that unless humankind experiences a rebirth of reverence and humility, planet Earth will be unable to support our species for many more generations. Now, in his great masterwork, the Purgatorio, Dante Alighieri describes the Mount of Purgatory and the place that various classes of sinners occupy along its heights. And the proud, those afflicted with pride, Dante imagines, they are assigned to the very base of Mount Purgatory, and they perform their penance by circumambulating the mountain with heavy stones fastened to their backs. And they are unable to stand up straight because of the weight of their burdens, and so these benighted souls spend their time there bent over with their eyes fixed perpetually on the ground. So all they ever see is humus, the earth of humility. But Dante says that given enough time, those guilty of excessive pride can, through their labor, internalize this lesson of humility and escape the pains of purgatory. Now, Dante meant this to be a cautionary tale, and we need not believe in a literal purgatory to appreciate the point he's trying to make. Our soaring pride, Helen Luke writes, will inevitably constellate in the unconscious a growing weight, which at last pulls down and crushes and destroys our personality. The good news, that of all the deadly sins, anger, envy, greed, sloth, lust, gluttony, of all the sins, pride is the one that is most susceptible to correction. Pride is more vulnerable than the other sins because it can be cracked wide open by suffering and disappointment and by the vicissitudes of human existence. If our hearts are not closed entirely, life's hard knocks teach us to be humble, and that can be a very good thing. It may be one of the keys to a more contented life. It may be the one human virtue that ultimately redeems our planet. As T.S. Eliot put it in his prescient poem, Four Quartets, the only wisdom we can hope to acquire is the wisdom of humility, because humility is endless. Blessed be, and amen.